Things would undoubtedly be a lot easier if we could choose who lived around us. But sadly, that option isn't available to most people. So, unless you want to be miserable every time you're at home, it's in your best interest to try and get along with your neighbors. Unless, of course, they have no interest in being friends with you, and they do everything they can to prove it. In that case, you're wasting your breath trying to be nice to them. There are a lot of ways that people can become nightmare neighbors. That's basically what happened with Oliver Lynch, and he made sure to show his neighbor what happens when you cross the line with him. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. While some people jump between houses every couple of years, Oliver had been a firm part of his neighborhood for more than 2 decades. He'd been living in his house in Osceola, Florida for 25 years, making him one of the area's most prominent residents. Lynch had seen many people come and go since living in Osceola, and he'd tried his best to socialize with as many of them as possible. When the move-in first came about, the space next to Oliver's home was actually empty. There was no house there, just a plot of land ready for development. The 79-year-old had gotten used to the grassland next door, especially as it meant he could easily admire the scenery by his home. However, he wasn't against someone putting a building there, especially if the person who moved in was a good neighbor. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of work to make a house, and it's not exactly a quiet process. During the day, there was a lot of noise as the home slowly began to take shape. As things started to come together, Lynch began wondering what his new neighbor would be like. Would they be kind or quiet? The neighbor had some ambitious plans for their home, and not all of them met Oliver's approval. The senior citizen came home one day to discover that the new resident wanted to make the divide between their properties very clear. They'd set up a row of cinder blocks along the driveway to establish where one house ended and the next one began. These blocks ran all the way up to the fence separating their yards, and they were pretty hard to ignore. Lynch wasn't sure what to make of this new development, but there was seemingly nothing he could do about it. The blocks had already been laid with cement, making them impossible just to lift up and move. However, that didn't mean Oliver was going to sit around while someone tried to block his driveway like that. He was willing to put up a fight. In them, it said that 2 driveways could be built next to each other, but it never said anything about them crossing over. His neighbor had come onto his property and established an inaccurate dividing line, something that Oliver wasn't going to settle for. He didn't know what the new resident was thinking, but the deed would surely put them in their place. They had to take responsibility for their actions. Unfortunately, despite having proof that he was in the right, the local authorities weren't willing to help Oliver out. Even with that copy of the deed, they said he had to resolve the issue himself, or taking the neighbor to court. Luckily, once people caught wind of what had happened, things soon started to work out in Oliver's favor. The pressure quickly mounted on his new neighbor, who felt compelled to resolve the matter. After talking with Lynch, the duo was able to reach an agreement, and the cinder blocks were finally removed. It was a great win for Oliver, but it put the other resident in an uncomfortable position. With all the drama they'd already caused in the neighborhood, who was going to appreciate him living there? The whole incident had completely caught Oliver off guard, especially as it had happened while he'd been out of the house. When he'd left in the morning, his driveway had been just as he'd expected it to be. Upon returning home hours later, everything had changed. Cinder blocks lined his driveway, taking up a ridiculous amount of space. It wasn't hard to figure out where they had come from, given the construction next door. The placement of the cinder blocks confused Oliver. They didn't benefit either of them. His neighbor lacked enough space to park a car, while Lynch lost a significant portion of his driveway. If they had discussed things beforehand, they could have reached a better solution. Lynch knew his word alone wouldn't be enough. His neighbor could claim ownership without proof. So Oliver gathered records confirming the driveway belonged to him. Osceola County validated his documents, making it clear that he was in the right. Despite having proof, there was a problem. Since the cinder blocks were already cemented in place, the county couldn't intervene. It was now up to Lynch to resolve the matter himself, which frustrated him. However, he soon figured out how to handle the situation. The best way to resolve the issue was to talk to the person responsible. Oliver approached his neighbor, hoping to reach an agreement. He believed a conversation would help them understand each other's perspectives and find a compromise. Unfortunately, his neighbor refused to budge. Lynch was baffled by his determination to take part of his driveway, but it was clear he wouldn't change his mind. With no other choice, Oliver considered escalating the matter, even if it meant going to court. Rather than taking legal action, Lynch had another idea. He decided to share his story with the local media, hoping public pressure would force his neighbor to remove the blocks. It was a gamble, but he chose to remain optimistic. As he had hoped, people rallied behind him. The more his story spread online and in the news, the more support he gained. His neighbors, who disapproved of the new residents' actions, were particularly vocal. Many believed the new neighbor's attitude didn't align with the Osceola community. His refusal to compromise made him unwelcome in their eyes, and he received a cold reception. Despite growing support, Lynch was still far from achieving his goal. Determined to keep the pressure on, he reached out to the media again to reignite interest in his case. He hoped the ongoing attention would make his neighbor reconsider. His efforts began to pay off. His neighbor finally approached him, wanting to talk. This was a positive sign. It meant that Lynch now had the upper hand. The new resident had seen how the media portrayed him and was concerned. He felt like his side of the story had been ignored. While he had his reasons, the pressure from the community had made him rethink his stance. The neighbor hadn't placed the cinder blocks on Lynch's driveway just for the sake of it. He had records stating the section belonged to him. However, this contradicted Oliver's proof, which clearly showed he owned the entire driveway. Eventually, the neighbor relented and agreed Oliver was in the right. He decided to remove the blocks immediately. Despite the conflict, the new resident insisted he had never meant to upset Oliver. The misunderstanding arose from incorrect information he had received. He believed the land belonged to him because of the documents he had, but that turned out to be a mistake. With everything cleared up, the neighbor agreed to remove the blocks, allowing them to move forward. People who followed the dispute were pleased to see the two resolve their differences. Lynch not only reclaimed his driveway, but also buried the hatchet with the man who would soon be his neighbor. Now, they had the chance to start fresh and possibly build a friendship. It was good they worked things out because, in reality, those few yards of driveway wouldn't have served much purpose for the neighbor unless he had specific plans to alter the front yard. Initially, it seemed like he was just being stubborn, trying to claim land that wasn't his. Oliver had never faced ownership issues in 25 years, so why was this suddenly a problem? Lynch's ordeal mirrored the struggle Franz Kafka described, an individual fighting against an unresponsive bureaucratic system. Despite owning the land and having legal proof, local authorities refused to step in. The issue could have been resolved much faster had they intervened, but instead, they left Oliver to deal with it alone. Most people wouldn't tolerate a neighbor encroaching on their property, but not everyone would fight for justice. After being ignored by both the authorities and his neighbor, it would have been easy for Oliver to give up, but he didn't. He stood his ground, and because of his persistence, everything worked out in his favor. Some might argue that fighting over a small section of a driveway wasn't worth the trouble. After all, Oliver contacted the media and even considered legal action. But just because his actions seemed excessive didn't mean he was wrong. He was simply defending what was rightfully his. By sharing his story publicly, Oliver attracted more attention than he had initially expected. Many people weighed in on the issue, with most agreeing that Lynch was being unfairly treated. Online discussions questioned why land he legally owned was being taken away. Some suggested the two should sit down and talk things out, which, in the end, is exactly what happened. Conflicts with neighbors are inevitable. While not all disputes are as serious as Oliver's, even minor annoyances, like a barking dog, can be frustrating. However, most people manage to resolve their issues in a responsible manner. That's the only way to reach a solution that works for both parties. The topic of physical divides between neighbors is often debated. A tall fence can create personal space and prevent constant interactions. However, when neighbors enjoy a friendly atmosphere, such barriers may be unnecessary. While conflicts are common, some people form strong bonds with their neighbors, treating them like close friends. This fosters a positive atmosphere, but can also make disputes more complicated, as disagreements could strain friendships. In the end, every neighborhood is different. Whether people get along or keep their distance, it's how they handle conflicts that truly matters. Some people never get to know their neighbors, preferring to keep to themselves. Oliver's neighbor may have believed that, at 79, he wouldn't put up a fight. But Lynch proved he was still determined and capable. His persistence ultimately led to victory. Oliver's story resonated with many because it was about standing up to a bully. Although the issue was later resolved, it initially seemed like he was being taken advantage of. Despite the challenges, Oliver held his ground and proved that perseverance pays off. Oliver confronted his neighbor, who was reportedly a minister. He found it ironic that someone who called himself a God-fearing man would act in a way that didn't reflect Christian values. Fortunately, the neighbor eventually acknowledged his mistake and made amends. Realizing he had started off on the wrong foot, the neighbor sought to repair his reputation in the community. Removing the cinder blocks was the first step in making his new home a welcoming place. Oliver could have ignored the issue and lived with the cinder blocks. But why should he? After 25 years in his home, he knew he had done nothing wrong. Faced with the possibility of legal action, he took the time to persuade his new neighbor to back down. Had he responded with anger, things might have escalated. While media attention helped, Oliver ultimately had to convince his neighbor himself. He remained polite and composed, refusing to let frustration get the best of him. His dignified approach is something we can all learn from. One of the great things about society is the ability to bring people together, no matter their differences.